Trauma is a complex issue, and there are many ways that we can deal with it, work through it, and acquire tools and learn skills to overcome it. My guest today is Lehandra Riley. She's a specialist wellness counselor, and I've invited her to come and talk to us and explain to us what her take is on trauma and how she works with trauma to help her clients. Lehandra, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always nice to check base with you again and be on your platform.
Awesome. All right, so let's just jump right in. You work with trauma, and as I said, you're a wellness counselor, specialist wellness counselor. So you see trauma a lot, I assume. What is your view on trauma, and how do you approach it starting with a new client?
So I use what they call the new definition of trauma. I don't see trauma as an event that happens to a person. It's more the reaction that the person has towards an event. So it's all body-based and based on the individual's reaction to whatever is happening to them. So it's not like the traditional definition of it has to be a traumatic event and it's external towards the internal. It's more the internal towards the external. So it's body-based. So I would focus on how does the trauma manifest in the person's body and holistically. How is the trauma affecting them? And what is their view on trauma? I think it's also important for the client I step into the client's world. I am but a passenger. I don't set the tone, I think, for a session as much as a lot of people do set the tone. I'm on a journey. I see the way I work as I'm on a journey with the client. The client is not stepping into my world. I'm stepping into their world. So also trying to see how they understand trauma, what is their definition of trauma, and what is their effect on their body, or how do they express that. And a lot of times I work with adults who have suffered childhood trauma or past trauma very far back in the archives of the memory. So the memory is not very reliable when trying to work through the trauma. So we focus on how does the body feel, because the past and the present can blur sometimes. So we work on how can we stabilize the body. So then you will see that, for example, in triggers, you will see that as when the person is triggered, what is happening. And then the person can tell me, for example, my heart is racing, or I'm sweaty, or whatever, or I've brain fog, or whatever they're experiencing. And then we work from there. And then we identify things like triggers, but it all starts with observing in the body, observing what's going on. I think that is the starting point. That is how something would start, instead of just jumping in and talking about something that can be potentially very triggering for the individual.
Okay, well, that makes sense, and I agree with you that we know that we carry trauma in our bodies. And for the longest time, we thought that it was in our heads. So for many years, we had lots of wonderful talk therapies, but we do know now that we need to address what the body has done in reaction to an experience. Can we take a moment and just go back to where you started talking about the old definition and the new definition?
Sure.
What was the old definition, and how is it very different? You have now talked about what you do looking at the body, but what was amiss previously?
Approaching trauma from a cognitive point of view. In other words, trying to rationalize trauma, which I would say, if you're familiar with Bessel van der Kolk's work and Peter Levine and any of those, I would call them the giants in trauma research currently, it is your cognitive brain goes offline. So there's no way you can rationalize yourself out of something that is triggering or affecting you in a distressing manner. So I think that was a miss, is the sort of just talk base. We're talking through it, but that's like opening up a wound, and then you haven't regulated the client, or you haven't actually given the client the tools to calm the body down. And then it's almost like going into the world with an open wound, and scratching in that wound every time you talk about it. So I think that was a miss, is not the healing didn't happen properly. It's almost like you're opening the wound and that's it. And it's open and open and open. And that can lead to re-traumatization. So I think that was a key ingredient that's missing, is not settling the body at all. Because we all focused externally, right? We focused on the event or what is causing the problem instead of the how. How am I feeling? Where am I feeling it in my body? How is the trauma being expressed? And that is what I think the two definitions or the two approaches, call them rather approaches. That's where the two approaches differ. I think it's more complementary to how trauma actually works, because I think people don't really understand how trauma worked up until recently by seeing it and also looking at brain scans and things like that as to pre and post trauma, and also when talking, when recounting an event, what is happening in the brain. Because you cannot make sense of something if your body is in complete distress. That is why a lot of people, you will have those awkward silence sometimes in a session with a client if you're going to be too cognitive or your approach is going to be too talk based, but you're not giving them a reprieve to calm the body down, not giving them tools to regulate and also co-regulate. I think it's also important for the counselor or for the practitioner to co-regulate, because sometimes our own bodies can also get triggered through whatever is being said in a session, because we're also empathic and we care. So that co-regulation is also extremely important.
Yeah, well said. So we know now that our nervous system and the brain stem, or the oldest or most primitive parts of the brain, are actually the things that react first
Yes,
to an event or an incident or an experience. And that leads to what happens in our bodies.
absolutely.
So, and it's only after that that the cognitive part of the brain comes back online and starts
Definitely.
making up a picture or a story of what happened, hey?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what you are mentioning now is a training that I recently attended by Bessel van der Kolk. It was a very long trauma seminar, and he actually mentioned that is your cover story. The story
Cover
you
story, that's a good
he
word, yeah.
calls it a cover story. He says that not to invalidate or call the person, I want to say, untruthful, but like we said before, the memory is not very reliable when it comes to trauma, because sometimes people disassociate. They can leave their bodies or completely feel alien from the vessel in order to absorb trauma. So that is why we tell ourselves the story to make sense of it, to rationalize it. But sometimes the sad thing is we cannot always make sense of what happened to us. All we have is a reaction or a feeling in the body. And once we start healing that, I think whatever happens, that's fine. You can have your cover story, you can adapt it, you can tell it to people just to sort of make sense, or it's almost like you want to put it in a box somewhere in your brain. It's like, I want to store it in that box or put it in that box. But that doesn't take away from the effect that that event or that encounter had on your body and on your soul as your person. And I think the biggest thing that it affects is also your core belief system. I think it affects that to an extent, to where you start, the cover story can also start sort of reinforcing that core belief. And sometimes the core belief is not congruent as to who you really are as a person. And then it can also contribute to that void that you sometimes people feel they have this void they have to fill. And then they self-medicate and they heal in ways that are not necessarily helpful for them. But that's not, like I say, a judgment. That is doing the best you can with what you have at the time.
Yeah, interesting. So if I grab onto the term cover story, a question that came up for me was, how would you respond to people saying that the way someone remembers a traumatic experience is not how it happened or is not true? or people who reveal abuse, for example, in their childhood, decades later, are often not believed or
Mm.
often told that they're lying or that they've got the facts incorrectly. How would you respond to that?
So the first thing is the feeling and what they remember, or the cover story is related to what they are feeling. And what
Mm,
they've experienced is extremely real.
mhm,
So sometimes, and this is a warped thing, the abuser justifies the abuse. So
mm,
it's almost like, let's say, corporal punishment, but we take it to the extreme. The father hits the child, but with a belt or whatever, and that event is very traumatizing for the child. Now, the child later on says, as an adult, that was abuse, or I
mm.
experienced this as abuse or trauma because of my body and whatnot. Then the
Yes.
father would invalidate that experience by saying, but no, I never abused you, because in his head, what he was doing was correct, because that's
Mm,
the narrative he's telling himself.
mm.
This is just purely an example, right?
Yeah.
So it's very important as a practitioner and also as a support for someone who's been abused or that discloses, to not invalidate that person.
Mm.
No matter what your thoughts are about what happened, it's not, we are not, I want to say, a court of law. We are not
Yeah.
here to, I want to say, you're lying or you're truthful. We're not
Mm,
here seeking, I want to say, empirical truth. We're seeking
mm.
truth for that person. And
Yes.
if that individual is telling you, this is how I've experienced this, and this is what I remember, we go with that and we hold
Mm.
space, because
Yes.
whatever needs to be healed needs to also be validated, because invalidation is also re-traumatizing that person
Mm,
and makes that person go into their shell, almost like a tortoise. They go back, and
mhm,
then you set that person back and you almost close a door for them where they could have had help, but now, because you're not believing them, as most people probably um, didn't believe them, they
mm.
see it as a not safe space. And I
Yeah.
think fostering that safety when someone discloses, it's not about whether I agree or not. To me, it's
Mm,
about how is it manifesting? How true is it for you? Because
mhm.
there's not really a singular objective truth. We all experience the world
Yeah.
subjectively from our own learned experiences and from our own frame of reference.
Mm,
So saying the person didn't see that event or that experience as abuse is basically telling them their subjective experience is invalid,
mm,
which can be very detrimental in terms of an approach. That's what I'm saying. It's very important not to be a black and white type of, this is correct, this is not correct.
mm,
Because like
mm,
I say, it's a cover story. We're not
mm,
always going to remember exactly, I want to say, to a T, all the
mm,
facts, especially if it happened 20, 30, 40 years ago.
mm,
Um, and also as kids, our brains are underdeveloped. We don't have adult minds, so we can't recount an event in perfection. It's
mm,
not, sometimes you can, depending on that individual child. I'm not saying it's not possible, sometimes it is, but for the majority of people, it's not always possible to
mm.
recount everything perfectly, but you can explain how it's affecting you in
Yes. But
detail,
that's real. You feel it every day
and
or
that's the
in every
focus.
moment. Yeah.
Yes.
So for argument's sake, anything can be traumatic to someone depending on how they react to it, that specific individual's unique reaction.
Yes. And how they
Something that I,
experience it.
yes, something that I always tell people when I do trauma debriefing, for example, right in the beginning, I feel it's important for people to understand that we have different views on an event or an incident. One person might think it's a horrible thing that happened, and another person might think nothing of it because it's an everyday occurrence in their lives. So there's a view or an opinion on things that differ between people, but there are also other factors. For example, if you didn't have a good night's rest and you're tired, if you hadn't eaten recently and your blood sugar is low, or if
Mm.
you're ill, a bit under the weather, you have a fever or whatever, or if you recently had an argument with somebody and you're still upset about that, all those things are factors that are going to influence how you react to something that happens in your immediate environment. So if you're very tired and your blood sugar is low and somebody yells at you, you're going to react differently to it than when you're well rested, you've just eaten, so your blood sugar is stable and you're not upset about anything. So there are ordinary things in our lifestyle that affect how we react, added on to, the aspects of what is actually happening to us. So that's
Absolutely.
something that I feel is very important for people to understand.
100% agreed. And I think to bring in the approach that I take is that's why I enjoy working from the salutogenic or holistic perspective, because we use tools such as the wellness wheel that looks at all of these aspects, like your physical health, your even your financial or your occupational health, because at work there could be something going on. And then that also blends, and that could be two traumatic experiences or distressing experiences that are not even related to one another, but it almost stacks in layers, because a lot of people that have been traumatized before, it's almost like other events stack on top of that. And like you said, 100% nutrition, hydration, sleep, all those things, 100% are questions that I ask my clients as well, where I say, how has your sleep been lately? Have you noticed changes also in the sleep? Because sometimes there will be dreams or there will be disturbances in the sleep when they're trying to do this healing work with trauma. And the journey is not linear. It's very much up and down, right? It flux. So like rightly so, I completely agree. If you have a day where you're under the weather or vulnerable physically, like we said, trauma lives in the body, absolutely. It will make it so much harder to do that work. And then sometimes people will tell me, no, I feel I'm going backwards in my healing journey. Then I'll be, but why are you saying to me you're going backwards? Because that's not necessarily what I'm observing. Then they'll tell me this, 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 and this. Well, I'm like, you've just had surgery, or you've just gotten over a divorce, or gotten over an event, or something happened to someone else, or there's grief or whatever else. And you have to look at it in context, where a lot of the times trauma survivors compare their lived experience with someone who did not suffer that trauma and expect themselves to be further along than where they are now. And then I'm like, well, for somebody who experienced X, Y, Z, and the other, hasn't eaten, didn't drink enough water, didn't get time to drink enough water, and perhaps have almost like a comorbidity, such as maybe anxiety, depression, or something else, for you, with all that stuff holistically, taking that small step is a major accomplishment. Taking that little step, even getting out of bed and brushing your hair, can be a huge accomplishment for somebody on a healing journey. But we should not compare ourselves to other people, because once again, subjective experiences, we all experience life differently. We all heal our trauma and whatever else we're dealing with much more different than another person would, depending on all these aspects.
Yeah, so there's no hard and fast rule of when something
Absolutely.
is traumatic or not. It's really up to every person
Yes.
whether it's going to be traumatic for them or not. Like I said, somebody might take a specific event in their stride, while it might literally, overwhelm the next person. So it's really a very unique individual thing. So we know that now, and we know that we have to uncover what our bodies have done in reaction to an event or an incident or an experience. How would I know that I have trauma that is unresolved that I need to address? How would I know that I need to reach out to get help?
I would start by, how is it affecting your day to day? So for me, I wanted to say the approach that I think a specialist wellness counselor or a wellness counselor in general takes is not we are focusing on the problem or the disease or the distress. We focus on optimal. What is optimal for you? What is your, if you think, what is your best day? Like, I feel healthy, I feel focused, I feel good in my body. This is me at my 100%, right? So if that is your 100%, but you want to get better, then obviously there's some coaching and stuff like that. But if you think there's something standing in your way of being optimal, whatever optimal means for you, then I would say it's worth getting curious about. It's not about I want to say like pop psychology or this sort of thing of, it's not most people that suffer trauma or mental health distress, they do not brag about it or feel that it's something they want to hang around their neck as it's almost like glamorizing it. And a lot of the times social media does that. And
Yes.
then there's an incongruence of, but you know what, if you actually suffered with this, you wouldn't go around and, I don't want to say advertise it, but it's more like there's a difference between telling your story and healing through that, as opposed to I'm looking for sympathy or I'm trying to, make this a thing. Almost like every second person has a thing, but it's not really a thing. So that can also be triggering to someone. But in terms of yourself, it starts with the individual. If you want to know whether something was traumatic for you, observe what's going on in my body. When I think about whatever distressed me, what is happening? Sometimes people don't even know. Sometimes they'll have bodily reactions and they won't even know. They'll have anger outbursts, or they'll all of a sudden become completely different people than what they used to. They're like, I don't know myself anymore. I'm reacting completely foreign as to how I would usually react towards my husband or my kids or my friends or whatever else. Then that could be a clue. I would say a healthy curiosity about yourself, I want to say, how you function in the world, and what is your definition of optimal functioning? And do you see a change? Is there a noticeable change in any of, I would say, I usually say, take the wellness wheel and look at each leg or each slice of the pie and see, is there changes there? What are those changes? And that could be something healthy to do for anyone, regardless of whether there's trauma or not, because it's always, we strive to heal. So there's always areas we can improve upon. So I think that's a good place to start and to look. And especially if you're observing changes that's foreign to you or a mystery to you, or you can't really pinpoint, you put your finger on, why am I acting so differently? What's going on with me? Or you feel almost there could be a struggle of identity, or almost like, I don't know who I am. I don't know who this person is. And that tells me that's a reactive response or reactive behavior instead of an authentic, this is my natural go-to response. So it's very much a personalized, individual stock take almost that you have to do, and not compare yourself to others, because also culture plays a big role as well, because that's how we are raised. So that's, as you said, something that's traumatic for one person isn't necessary for another. And it also depends on your culture, your temperament. There's a lot of things that play a role. So I think it's very much, again, individual based. And I think trust your gut, trust that intuition in you. I'm sure everybody has that intuition or that little voice inside, whether it's a voice or a feeling that says, listen, here, something's not quite right here. So I would say also trust your gut, because there's also a gut trauma link. So literally in the stomach. So not just the metaphorical gut, but the gut as in the physical gut as well.
Yes. Yeah. Very interesting. You mentioned changes in behavior that we can notice in ourselves. Do you think it's possible for us to have trauma or have experienced something and carry it through our lives without it really impacting us, and then suddenly out of the blue it can pop up or manifest in a way?
It can, especially if you've been suppressing it. So a lot of times this will be evident in, I'm just going to give an example. Say, for example, there was childhood trauma, but you were invalidated as a child and told your emotions, your feelings, or whatever else is not valid, the event didn't happen. So you were in effect gaslit to your experience or invalidated for your experience. So it's almost like you park it away somewhere. You put it in the closet or you put it in the proverbial box and you file it away. And sometimes that cupboard can later on in life open up and everything falls out. Now, the reason why it can manifest later, where it's almost like, I wanted to say it's like it's dormant in a way. It's dormant or in a latent phase where you don't see it or experience it. The reason for that is because that is a way of surviving during that period of your life. So as a teenager now, let's say something happened as a child, as a teenager, to survive, to actually get through school and get through what you need to do, and also the bodily changes that comes through puberty and whatever else, I want to say, to survive and stay sane, there's no possible way you can deal with it. And some people are too vulnerable and raw and dealing with just surviving. To open that closet would be not something that they're ready to do. That's why a lot of people will try and force counseling or therapy or a process, but they're not really ready for it. They first have to do almost like an emotional first aid and cultivate resilience before actually opening that door. And that's why, as a practitioner, I think it's also important not to force people to open doors that they're not ready to open towards themselves, because then you're forcing people to confront things that they don't feel ready to confront. And sometimes that can take years. For some people, they're only ready to confront certain things that happen to them 20, 30 years later. And there's no timeline for healing trauma. I think that's the main thing. There's no, in a lot of times, young people will feel, I have to do this. It's almost like they work on a schedule, because in school it's 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It's literally like almost like there's a ticking time clock for everything. But for trauma, there's not. You have to wait until holistically you are in a space to confront and to deal with whatever comes through that door, whatever, when you open the door, whatever is there, you can deal with it. And that's what I'm saying, the core beliefs, to come back to that, is so important, because a lot of times people that experience trauma, especially emotional abuse, they developed a warped sense of self, and they hate themselves or part of themselves, and that belief is so real. It's almost like a fact for them. So whatever is behind the door can also validate in some way that false sense of self. And that's also what doesn't make them ready to confront that. So then you work on positive things such as, who am I? And then you confront that as, you know what, that's part of who I am. That's, call it my shadow self, or the self that is not favorable. We all have that side of ourselves that's not necessarily favorable, or the pretty side. But whatever it is, I love myself regardless. It's almost like loving yourself as you would think a mother would love an innocent newborn child on a clean slate. And having that love really helps. Even if you don't have that love, you can cultivate it, but that love for self has to be there to a certain extent before confronting certain traumas. Just to, I want to say, cultivate resilience. I think that's very important.
Yeah, we have to be good and ready for it, and capable of dealing with it, bearing it, and really unpacking it, as they say. What would you say to someone who is in a relationship or in a family, and they are aware that they've been traumatized, they're coming for sessions with you, and they're working through the stuff and uncovering the stuff and going through the motions of healing, but they don't have support from the people around them? They get negative feedback, or they're told that they're crazy, or that they're stupid, or overreacting, and all sorts of things that we hear. What would you advise somebody in such a situation to do?
That's a very sad situation to be in, and it's very difficult for someone to be strong in a situation like that, because it's almost like we are trying to counter what these people are saying on a daily basis, such as you're stupid, you're whatever, because we're trying to change that narrative. But I mean, even if you take an experiment, if you tell someone they're ill, enough times, even if they're 100% healthy, they will later on believe that. And we are very much, as humans, sadly, a negative thing that's being said about us, we tend to hold on to that much longer than a positive thing being said, because it's almost like we justify, oh, they're just saying that because they're being nice. But when someone says something bad, it's almost like, but maybe that's true. Maybe I am that bad person. So having I want to say a lack of a support system makes the journey much harder. However, what is important is, what is your truth? I would say start there. Who am I? And it's important to tell the world who you are instead of the world telling you who you are. And I wanted to say, I always come from a thing of, I'm not the expert in your life. You are the expert in your life. You are the healer of yourself, your self-healing individual. And you are the expert of you, as I am the expert of myself. So who is anyone to tell you who you are apart from yourself? Yes, we can give different perspectives, but I would say to somebody who struggles in support systems, do what you can to survive in that situation, because that's all we can do, especially if there's a power imbalance, or not a power, like a power structure, such as a parent and a child, or a boss and an employer. You can't just quit your job and sit on the street, even if your boss is the most abusive person on earth. It's a rock and a hard place. You can't just, if you live with your parents and you're studying and your parents are being verbally abusive, even if they don't realize it, sometimes this is generational stuff. My mom treated me like this, so this is how I'm programmed to treat my kid. And it's sometimes people don't realize what they're doing. And it's not about intention. I mean, if you cut someone, they bleed, no matter the intention behind it, and there's still a wound. So in order to build resilience is be open to observing who is your tribe. Try and seek friends that are supportive and healthy. And also, even if the sessions that you're having is a form of a support for you, then that's still better than having nothing. But it's important to try not to, I want to say, don't adopt a truth that's not your own. I always say, don't answer to a name that doesn't belong to you. So it's the same thing as if I call you Cindy, you're going to be like, huh, who's Cindy? I'm Sinta,
Yeah.
So it's the same thing with these negative things, such as you're stupid. I'm like, I know for a fact I'm not stupid. You must be talking about someone else. And it's hard to do that in the beginning, because it's been so almost like brainwashed in you to believe that. But you have to start consciously doing it. In other words, and this is something anyone can practice, I think, when someone is being negative or being, saying things that are not necessarily true. It's like, we're not going to change that person. We're not going to be able to tell them. Sometimes as a parent, we're scared to speak up. So we're scared to say, listen here, but this is actually wrong what you're saying, because then it can perpetuate conflict. But then just like, sort of, okay, they're talking about someone else, because I know I am, and I know I'm not who you are saying. And sometimes they're projecting things of themselves onto others. So understanding that's where I want to say the cognitive part comes in handy, is sort of understanding that it's not a me problem, it's a them problem. It is stuff that they're putting onto me. But again, body-based. We first need to have those tools to calm our bodies down before we can actually think in that way. So lack of a support system does not mean healing can't happen. A lot of people feel scared, but I think if you find the right person to share your journey with and the right person to hold space and you feel safe, that can make a world of difference. If you find a practitioner or a person that can share your journey with you, and sometimes that can even just be a neighbor who's nice to you and offers you a cup of coffee and just gives you that love and that kindness that you're not getting elsewhere. But again, in a healthy way, not in a, I wanted to say, in a toxic way, or in a way that reinforces what's happening with the negativity in the environment. And find a way to change the environment. Sometimes it will happen fast, sometimes it will take time, such as changing a job. You can't just quit because there's a toxic boss there or a toxic colleague, but you can look for other opportunities. You can, I want to say, put your hazmat suit on, stand in the toxic water, but look for another place to be, a place where you can thrive, not merely survive.
Because environmental aspects are also part of the wellness wheel. So like you mentioned earlier, we have to look at all those things, all in good time. So yeah, support and having people who see us and validate what we're going through is very, very important, but we can manage to heal without it as well. What would you say to somebody who is in a relationship and aware or able to see that their partner has got unresolved trauma, but the partner won't get help, or a child who can see and is aware that the parent needs to get help to, work through some unresolved trauma, but they just won't do it? What would you say to those of us who have to stand by and watch other people who need help but refuse to get it, or just don't realize that they need it?
That's a very difficult situation, because at the end of the day, we are only responsible for our own healing. We cannot be responsible for the healing of other people. And the reason why I'm saying that is you have to want it for yourself. We are self-healing. We cannot heal ourselves if we don't want to do that. And we cannot take responsibility for other people's healing. And it can even be traumatic to watch someone in a way self-destruct or hurt themselves and not get the help they need. But unfortunately, that is not something that's within our control. We can bring, like the saying is, jy kan die perd tot by die water bring, maar jy kan hom nie maak drink nie. It's literally, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. We cannot force someone to partake in the water of healing if they don't want to. That is, we can plant seeds. We can subtly leave hints. And also, I find that once in cases like that I've had where, let's say I have someone coming to me for their own healing journey, and they say, but they think their partner also needs help. So their partner or their mom or their kid or whatever also needs help. They can see now, identify, because again, it starts with observing. So they can identify certain things now. So I said, well, lead by example. They will see a change in you with you going to a practitioner, and they will see, oh my word, my mom is different, my partner is different, my mom or my granny or whoever is, there's changes happening here, and it's maintained, it's sustainable. It's not just a foofy, it's not an overnight thing, it's a sustainable lifestyle change. So maybe that will work for me as well, because we don't know whether those people have been hurt in the past, not only by obviously other people in their social circles or in the environment, but also maybe by a practitioner. I've had an experience like that where I went to somebody for counseling and I explained to them how I was feeling, because I've been observing what I said earlier, behavior that's different, shifts and changes. And to me, that doesn't just happen in a vacuum. There should be a reason for why is something different in my life. And this counselor flat out told me there's nothing wrong with me. And by saying that, I think she meant well by saying you're healthy or whatever, according to her, but that's invalidating my experience and what my gut is telling me. That's invalidating, listen here, hang on, I see a light flickering here, almost like in a car, I see that light flickering on my dashboard, but I know nothing about cars, so I don't know what this light is about. Please help me. Oh no, just ignore that light, it's fine. And then that could, exactly. So that can also be a reason. Or how, like again, cultural. There's sometimes a big stigma around seeking help, especially with men. It's seen as a weakness, or it's seen as, I need to be strong. I need to be the strong one. If I seek help, then I'm no longer the strong one. So then I'm not, it's sort of a thing of then I'm weak, whatever. Sometimes with women as well, it's seen as a weakness. It's like, I'm supposed to be strong, seeking help is weak. Whereas it's the biggest strength to be able to put your hand up and say, I need help. And I think it's, before we started recording what you mentioned about the first responders, and you mentioned how it's sometimes difficult for people who are first responders to seek help. And doctors make the worst patients. Now, it's the same thing in this case. If you're a healer yourself, it's sometimes difficult to seek healing yourself because you feel, I have to be strong, I have to be strong. But seeking that help and those things are absolute. I commend people for that. And that's why I think part of my slogan is it starts with the first step. The first step is the most important. That is a decision you have to rationalize and figure out for yourself in your own head. No one else can tell you to take that first step. They can encourage you, but if you're not ready, again, like I said before, if you're not ready to open certain doors, no one can force you to. But we can only hold space for that individual, and we can only support. And by doing things such as listening, and I wanted to say also learning what their triggers are, so we don't, I want to say, put fuel on the fire. If we know someone is triggered by something and we can make their life a little bit easier, we don't put fuel on the fire. We hold space and we ask them, how can I support you? I oftentimes say, don't support in the way you need to be supported. It's like love languages. So what is your support language? How do you need to be supported? Do you need a cuddle or a hug? Do you need me to hold your hand? Can't you tolerate physical touch right now, but you need me to just listen? What is your support language in that way? Like, what is your need? How can I make the space, I wanted to say, favorable for healing for you right now where you're at this point? And sometimes we get healing and then we leave people behind because obviously you're healing, but then the other person is left right where they were. It's almost like in school. It's like now you get an education, but someone else didn't go to school and didn't start that education. But the only way we can do it is make people curious and plant those seeds. So I think that is what I would say, and to not let that stop you from healing yourself.
Yeah, well said. Thanks for that, Leandra. I think it's very important that we realize again, and I can't stress it enough, that the journey with trauma is unique to every individual, and the way we deal with it, the time we take with it, is unique to every person. There is no deadline to it, and there is no recipe that works for everybody. It's really different for everyone.
100%.
Yeah. Something that I have seen rather often is people who are struggling, they're having challenges or they're having relationship issues, and they are unaware that the root of that is unresolved trauma. Something I've heard people say so often is, I have no trauma. I had a great childhood. Everything was fine. I turned out just fine. There's nothing wrong. How can you start uncovering where that trauma lies, where it originated? How can you help somebody who's really unaware of anything to find where it is, what it was that happened?
That's a very good question. And I think that oftentimes, and this is what I've noticed with people that don't necessarily, they notice overt trauma. Like I said, for example, physical abuse or overt things such as I was in a car wreck or something bad happened to me. We don't recognize necessarily, call it the micro things, the little things, or again, cultural. This is how I was raised, generational things.
Yes.
Sometimes the parent would have also experienced trauma, but the parent doesn't even acknowledge that trauma in their past. And now it's continuing. So a lot of the times it's almost like you have to become a cycle breaker. You have to change. So what I would say, and this is a nice question if we're talking about childhood trauma or trauma from the past, from, I would say, family structure or dynamics, a nice question to ask is, how would you, if you had a child or if you have a child, how would you raise your kids? And how does that compare to how you were raised? And then sometimes people will pick up, but hang on, I don't scream at my kids when they do something wrong. I'm changing that. I didn't find that very helpful as a child.
Mm.
Then you would ask, well, did you experience that in your childhood where people screamed at you for making a mistake? You're like, well, yeah, I actually did. It's like, how did that screaming at you, how did that affect you? Or
Mm.
how do you feel about it now? How do you think it affected you? And people are like, well, that was actually not right. And I think
Mm.
coming to terms with being abused by a parent or a person that didn't have that malicious intent. That is the thing. A lot of times we put our loved ones on a pedestal, they can do no wrong. You understand
Mm.
what I'm saying? It's like, that's my mom, that's my dad. They will never hurt me. They love me. But
Mm.
then because we put them on that pedestal, we miss some of the red flags. And that sometimes then goes into our relationships with a partner where certain things are done where we're like, but we love this person. We deeply love them, that they're just having a bad day, where we struggle to sort of identify certain things.
Mm.
So it's all
Mhm.
about, again, coming back to observing and planting those seeds,
Mm.
and asking those questions as to, what would you do differently? And it's not necessarily about identifying trauma. I think it's a good question to ask yourself. How would you improve? It's almost like
Mm.
um, version 2.0 of the next generation.
Yeah.
What updates are there? What
Mm.
what changes would you make? How would you improve and build upon that? And which, I want to say, building blocks are you completely going to eliminate? And
Mm.
it's not about finding fault, because a lot of times people will say, oh my word, they will realize that my parent or my caregiver was such a horrible person. And
Mm.
now that person I've put on a pedestal is no longer there. And
Mm.
that can really like shake the foundations and
Mm.
of that person's view of their parents and stuff like that, and influence their relationship. And that's where I want to say, when that shift happens, it can be very difficult, because now you're viewing it from a different perspective. And now you're like, but that was messed up. I would never do that to my kid. Why did my parents do that? And now we're focusing on the why, but not on the body again. And that's
Right.
what I'm saying. We have to get back to the body, and then we can ask those questions. And unfortunately, if someone is programmed to behave in a certain way and you find that distressing, you're not always going to get that apology. You're not or anyway even going to get the recognition of, I'm sorry, I did something wrong.
Mm.
Especially if that person was raised in a generation where apology is tantamount to weakness. So,
Mm.
especially in the older generations. So, again, we don't have control over an apology that someone could give us that wronged us. We can only bring awareness and also put boundaries in place and
Mm.
not allow that behavior to continue. It's like, you're not going to speak to me like that anymore. I will walk away, or
Mm.
I will end the conversation, and we will speak in a way that is civil, but I'm not going to tolerate being called XYZ anymore. And like I said before, that's sometimes difficult, especially if you're dependent on that person. So it's also pick your battles again and do what you need to do to survive. And I think also, if sometimes we become like that, that's why we also sometimes don't like ourselves, because we will copy some of that behaviors, once
Mm.
again, that we're programmed to do. But we always have an ability to change. But we cannot change what we don't acknowledge or what we're not even observing. So I would say plant seeds, acknowledge, and do what you can. And
Mm.
because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to do the best we can.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, thank you for that. It's not easy to support someone else who is refusing to get help or refusing to do the work that they obviously need to do.
Mm,
Yeah, it's very
it's
hard
very
sometimes.
hard. But that
So,
should not impede on your own journey. I think that's the message
okay.
here. It should not stop you from growing. And
Mm.
sometimes, unfortunately, if someone refuses to get help, and that is actually adding to your trauma, such as, let's say, you're in a household where someone's an alcoholic, and
Mm.
that behavior, that addiction behavior, is being negatively affected, such as the person is driving in a car and you have to get in the car and it's dangerous and stuff like that, then again, that's the boundary. Boundaries
Mm.
for survival. And that's the only thing we can do. Unfortunately, we cannot compel someone to change. We can only plant the seeds for them. And make sure we are safe. I think safety first, physically and holistically, just being safe. I think that's very important.
Very important. I couldn't agree more. So I want to ask you a last question. We know now that our body reacts to an event, and that is where the trauma is originated. Do you think that we need to know what happened in the past that caused it, or can we just work on the symptoms that we're carrying in the body? Do we need to remember what it was?
Not necessarily. Like I say, sometimes even remembering can re-traumatize a person. So I would say start with your goal. What is your healing goal? What is your goal? What do you need right now? I always say let's start with the now. What does your body and your spirit and your holistic being need right now? And we build on that. Because sometimes those answers will never come. Like I say, sometimes the cover story is just that, it's a cover story. We don't necessarily have all the facts. Also, we are healing now with the brain of an adult, but we experienced certain things as a child. We were literally a different human being at the time when certain things took place. So trying to make sense of that is very difficult, especially if you don't have a sibling or a person that knows what you're talking about or were physically there when the event happened, then it's also difficult to piece that together. And I know not knowing can drive some people up the wall. And what I would recommend for that is if you really want to know, hypnotherapy and that sort of thing can help. However, ask yourself, are you ready for whatever comes up? Because I would rather protect myself, because there's a reason why you struggle to remember. It's your body protecting you from knowing that. So are you ready to open that door and to know? Because that's the thing of, I think, where the whole eating from the tree of knowledge. And I'm not really a religious person, but that metaphor is very powerful, because it's a bell you can't unring. Once you have that knowledge, you cannot be the person you were before. You are, that knowledge is going to change you and is going to change your perspective. But my question is, are you irrevocably, unconditionally ready to hear that message, or to hear what happened then, or whatever you experienced? Is being a detective and finding the truth with risking potentially your peace and your safety and your sense of your core, your safety, your stability. And that is I want to say, the $1,000,000 question, when you want to go do a deep dive into your past or into the archives, be ready for whatever might jump up there. Because children oftentimes protect themselves by not remembering specifics of events. But if you go back and you do remember specifics of events, you're going to view people differently. You're going to view yourself differently. You're going to feel different because you're now an adult looking back. So it's all about, are you ready for that? And there's a reason why that information has been, I want to say, it's there, but it's almost like in a vault, or it's protected from you knowing it. There's a reason for it. And like I say, that reason is protection, because we are self-healers and we heal the best we can with the tools we have at that specific time. So that would be my answer, is all about, I want to say, if you want to step behind the unknown or the door, be prepared for whatever might jump out. So that resilience needs to be there.
Yeah, I love what you said about us being self-healing. So it's also important to pay mind to how we did react in the past to protect ourselves, to cope with situations, and to ensure that we survive them. And there's sometimes good reason for that. So it's not always necessary to revisit things in the past or to even relive them, because, like you've mentioned before, so that can be re-traumatizing.
Yes.
So there's risk attached to it also in some instances. So it's important, like you said, to know that whether you're ready for it, have the capacity for it, or at the very least have the support to help you through that if it really overwhelms you.
Absolutely. I would definitely, if someone has questions about their past and it's really important for them to get those answers. Resilience is part of having a support system. It is, look at your resilience, look at that you have a soft place to fall.
Yes.
Where can you go when you're vulnerable? That you
Mm.
don't just go sit in a corner and withdraw, and then it just makes things harder for you again. Protecting your peace and protecting your sense of self is so important, because that could potentially undo work you've done before, if you've been on a healing journey before. So it all depends on, why is this important for you? And it's not necessarily, you don't have to have all the facts to heal. Like I said before, we're not judge and jury, and we're not in a
Mm.
legal situation. So we're not in a situation of, I want to say, putting a stamp of approval on someone saying you're telling the truth or you're remembering it perfectly. It's not about that. That's got nothing to do with healing. Healing has to do with what is your truth now? How is this affecting you now? And what tools, how can we update the toolbox? I always say
Yes.
that to heal, we have that toolbox. And in the past, sometimes we can judge ourselves for how we dealt with something or healed from something in the past, and put in it almost, there's a shame sometimes there. It's a shame of, you know, I looked the other way when my brother or sister was being hit. But
Mm.
why did you do that? Because if you opened your mouth, you would have gotten hit as well. So
Mm.
you did that to protect. You didn't do it because you didn't want to help. It's just,
Yeah.
you did what you could with what you had at the time.
Mm.
So also seeing it like that, and not putting a shame or a judgment on. And sometimes when there is shame, I think a tip would be, from a practitioner side, is to understand why the shame is there, not invalidate the shame itself as well. In other words, not saying, oh, you don't have to feel shame about that. I would say, well, I'd probably carry that shame with me as well if I was in your shoes. But maybe see it from the perspective of, you were a child, this was your age, this was your situation, and this is your situation now. So
Mm.
now you can protect and speak up about it, because you're an adult. The power imbalance isn't there. Again,
Mm.
you don't
Mm.
have this adult that you're dependent on. You can walk away. You're an adult now yourself.
Yes.
So now we're updating the toolbox. We are not
Mm.
invalidating the toolbox of the past, but we are updating. We're keeping what works, and we're leaving what doesn't work in the past, or with that part of us that we were in the past.
Mm.
I think that's also important.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. There's no shame in having been traumatized at any time in your life. And there's certainly no shame in reaching out, getting help with that trauma. In fact, I think it's a sign of strength and courage for somebody who is willing to step into that space, to do the work, to learn more about themselves. And like you said, I also use that term, to update their systems, upgrade their toolbox, and grow so that they can thrive. Yeah.
100% agreed. 100%.
Mm.
There's no shame in it. And I think that it can be a tremendous gift, I think, to heal and to allow yourself to start that journey. It's a
Mm.
gift that money can't buy. And whether
Yes.
you heal on your own, and I want to say, you read books by people who have undergone trauma and you use their knowledge to heal yourself, or if you don't feel ready to speak to somebody, you don't always have to speak to somebody or go to a practitioner. It helps, it speeds up the process. But again, we are self-healing.
Mm.
There's no obligation for somebody to, it's almost like, oh, I have to see the doctor or the
Mm.
whoever to help me. And then the focus
Mm.
of the self-healing isn't there. So it's also
Yes.
important to use the practitioner as a tool, not
Mm.
as a,
Mm.
oh, this is the cure, this is going to heal me, or this person. Again, the practitioner is not responsible for your healing. You're responsible for your healing. And then the question remains, is that practitioner a helpful tool at the end of the
Yes.
day?
Yeah.
So the practitioner can even be a tool or an aid in your toolbox, but ultimately you are in control. And I think that's very important, especially for survivors of sexual assault,
Mm.
to get that autonomy back, to get, this is
Mm.
my choice. I
Mm.
made this choice. I'm the healer. I'm taking back control. especially not like I'm saying with sexual assault survivors, but also with anyone who's been physically abused, because autonomy and control were taken from them. So to get that back, it's very empowering to say, you know what, I made this decision for myself. I'm the healer. No one else is responsible for my healing but me.
Awesome. Lehandra, thank you so much. This has been a very interesting conversation. Much gratitude to you for sharing your wisdom and your experience. And yeah, thank you once again. I hope we'll chat to you again soon.
Of course, and thank you so much for having me and for sharing your input and perspectives on trauma and healing. I think it's very important to cultivate awareness around it, and I think to just plant those seeds for growth and to whatever that growth is for you, whether that means you grab a book from the library and you read that, but whatever that means for you, just to start that journey, whatever that journey's start might be. Even listening to our conversation could potentially be a start for somebody.